We begin the day with two keynote speakers, Dr. Judith Plaskow and Dr. Mara Keller. Dr. Plaskow's address is entitled, Speaking New Words, Carol as Storyteller, Critic, and Theologian. Judith Plaskow and Carol Chris met in graduate school at Yale University, pursuing their PhD degree in religious studies. Both were interested in theology. They became increasingly interested in feminism while at Yale, and subsequently as they engaged careers in academia. Together, they have edited two major anthologies centered on women and religion, Women's Spirit Rising, 1979, and Weaving the Visions, 1989, that served to shape the field of feminist studies in religion. Judith authored the first book of Jewish feminist theology in 1991, standing again at Sinai. She has published prolifically since then. In 2011, she was elected president of the American Academy of Religion. Her latest collaboration with Carol Chris was the book they co-authored, Goddess and God in the World, Conversations in Embodied Theology. Judith, like Carol, has been a visionary, ahead of her time, who has helped pull our culture forward toward a more just and desirable future. Welcome, Dr. Plaskow.
Thank you. Okay, I couldn't turn on my video, but there I am. It's both a pleasure and a source of pain to be here today. Women's stories have not been told. This is the first sentence of Carol's first solo book, and it announces a central theme of her work for the next 40 years. Without stories, she says, there is no articulation of experience. Stories give shape to our lives. They provide a map of the world, a sense of meaning, a way of coming to know ourselves within the framework of larger cultural narratives. When women are forced into the constraints of male stories, we live, and I quote, in the interstices between our own vaguely understood experience and the shapings given to experience by the stories of men. We lack direction, a feeling for what comes next, and for the many choices we're likely to confront in our lives. Carol's work seeks to rectify this great injustice, to begin to give voice to some of the many stories of women. The text that started her on the journey that led to her first book, Diving Deep and Surfacing, an exploration of spiritual quest in women's literature, was Doris Lessing's The Four-Gated City. I remember when Carol discovered Lessing's Children of Violence novels at some point during our graduate studies at Yale. During my second and Carol's third year, it hit us suddenly that at no point in any of our courses had we read a single book or article by a woman. But before we became feminists, we hadn't noticed this. Whose work would we be reading? Who wrote theology, after all? When we finally recognized this great absence, our minds exploded. What did it mean to be training to be theologians if women didn't do theology? Theology grapples with fundamental human questions, the nature of the sacred, of human beings and the world. How could we not have women's perspectives on these subjects so essential to our humanity? Lessing's The Four-Gated City and her whole Children of Violence series, which it completes, came to us as a revelation. Here was a rich and complex narrative about a woman's life in the mid-20th century that situated the protagonist, Martha Quest, in the context of the social and political currents in Europe at the time. We were swept off our feet. In the Watergate summer of 1972, when Carol was supposed to be writing her dissertation, she was instead working on an article on Doris Lessing that ultimately became a chapter in Diving Deep. At the same time, I was using Lessing in the first chapter of my dissertation to help define women's experience. Carol was interested primarily in Martha's spiritual quest in the novels, while I mined them to define the everyday trajectory of women's lives. Our projects were different but complementary, and we talked about the novel regularly for years. To use a term I would not have used at the time, the series functioned as our Torah. We went back to it again and again to illumine our own experiences and those of other women. Every time we faced a new challenge or came to some new feminist insight, we would connect it to something Martha had experienced in one of the novels. Children of Violence sets out many of the themes that Carol explores in depth in Diving Deep and Surfacing in relation to numerous texts by women. The experience of nothingness, of not having a narrative that can orient one in the world, of not being valued or learning to value oneself, is described with great power by Lessing and becomes a leitmotif in Carol's work. In the case of Martha and many of the other literary figures Carol discusses, the encounter with nothingness is followed by awakening to a sense of being part of a larger cosmos that grounds and sustains the self, a mystical identification with the great powers of nature. This awakening may lead to a new naming of self and reality, a fresh orientation toward the world that makes it possible to resist the voice of the eternal self-hater and to question the dualisms of body and spirit, self and world, reason and emotion that so often structure women's experience. These core concepts, the experience of nothingness, awakening, mystical identification, new naming, appear again and again in Carol's work and structured much of her teaching over the years. In the last chapter of Diving Deep and Surfacing, she shows how these ideas are expressed in many of the art forms of women's culture in the 1970s, the lyrics and melodies of feminist songwriters and musicians, the celebration of the body in feminist art, and the rituals springing up in many different arenas. In naming these developments, Carol was both participating in them and validating and expanding on them, putting them out there for others to recognize and claim. The two books we edited together in the 1970s and 80s, Woman Spirit Rising and Weaving the Visions, were contributions to this same project of claiming women's experience in a new key. We weren't gathering stories in the sense that Carol defines them in Diving Deep and Surfacing, but we were trying to capture the namings of self, God, and the world that were beginning to emerge in churches and synagogues, in a burgeoning women's spirituality movement, and among feminists in our field of religious studies. In looking back at Woman Spirit Rising today, I'm struck by how the consciousness-raising groups Carol and I were both part of in the late 1960s and early 70s were a touchstone for that work. We were seeking essays that reflected the sense of release, liberation, and energy that followed on casting off male definitions of women and fearlessly articulating our own experiences in company with other women. We wanted authors who were speaking what had not been spoken before. As we say in the introduction, consciousness raising leads to a critique of culture and to the task of transforming or recreating it. What did this mean, we asked, for the Bible and for all religious traditions that demean women? If, as we insisted, feminism places a question mark over every cultural institution, if none can any longer be viewed as inevitable and necessary, then how should women respond to the religious traditions in which we were raised? We organized Woman Spirit Rising around the deep disagreement that marked our own replies to the question of whether to remain connected to and try to change a patriarchal tradition or leave and attempt to create something new. While we never lost our conviction that this is a crucial question with which every generation of women must grapple, over time, we also came to recognize the justice of the critiques of the way we had labeled these different choices, reformist and revolutionary. In creating that binary, we downplayed the important differences that existed within each group. We also angered some of the women we put in the reformist section because they saw the distinction as hierarchical and read us as claiming that revolutionaries were somehow more fearless and therefore superior. I suppose I myself unconsciously felt this bias, which is why in Woman Spirit Rising, I tried to keep a foot in both camps. By the time we came to edit Weaving the Visions 10 years later, we were more settled in our divergent paths, but we also realized that we needed both a different structure for the book and to greatly expand the breadth of the essays we included. Instead of organizing our second volume around religious differences among women, we used the framework of the traditional theological categories of history, God, man, quote unquote, and world, but named them differently and filled them with new meaning. We recognized that in repeatedly invoking women's experience in Woman Spirit Rising, we had universalized white middle-class women's experience in much the same way that dominant theologies had equated humanness with maleness. This time, we would offer a rich diversity of theological perspectives and spiritual paths within each section of the book. In juxtaposing voices from widely different cultural and religious contexts, we hope to communicate the sophistication and range of feminist religious thought, its fecundity, complexity, and multiple disagreements. As we said in the introduction, we wanted to make clear that feminist thought is not just about women's issues that can be safely tucked away on the margins of theological or theological discourse, but about the fundamental naming of ourselves, the universe, and the sacred powers that sustain us. Feminism addresses basic theological questions in a different voice, bringing to articulation women's experience as it intersects with the particularities of religion, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation. In the period between Carol's publication of Diving Deep and Surfacing in 1980 and our editing Weaving the Visions in 1989, Carol was taking her work in new directions. As she acknowledges in the preface to the second edition of Diving Deep, she struggled mightily with the issue of voice as she was writing that book. Valuing her own experience, yet wanting to be accepted by an academic community that rewarded so-called objective scholarship, she made the uneasy compromise of relegating personal experience to the preface and writing the rest of the book in the third person. By the time she published Laughter of Aphrodite in 1987, she was centering her own experience in a much more robust way by describing the life events in which her theology was grounded. This book marked the beginning of a commitment to personal writing that characterized the rest of her career and is central to the blogs for feminism and religion that she penned regularly over the last decade. Odyssey with the Goddess, which she published in 1995 and rewrote 20 years later as The Serpentine Path, is probably the most deeply personal narrative of her journey to Greece and the goddess and her passage from despair to healing and rebirth. As she says in the afterword to the third edition of Diving Deep and Surfacing, in Diving Deep, she analyzed the theme of spiritual quest in the works of women writers, while in Odyssey, she became the writer, telling the story of her own spiritual quest. When she wrote that women's stories must be told, she said, she was naming the life-giving power that she felt in finding her own experiences captured by the narratives of other women. Over time, she felt compelled to tell her own story, hoping that it would provide others with a language to make sense of their own lives. It is striking the extent to which Carol's account of her life in Odyssey echoes the themes she developed in Diving Deep, the experience of nothingness, awakening, mystical union, and the new naming of self and reality. But I do not want to talk about Carol simply as a storyteller, because that would leave out of account her brilliant critical and theological writing. Beyond insisting on the importance of women's untold stories and relating her own, Carol offered trenchant analyses of how women's stories had come to be erased or marginalized. Why Women Need the Goddess, probably her best known and most influential essay, begins with a compelling discussion of the psychological and political effects of religious symbols. In her words, and I quote, religious symbols centered on the worship of a male god create moods and motivations that keep women in a state of psychological dependence on men and male authority, while at the same time legitimating the political and social authority of fathers and sons in the institutions of society. This critique was repeatedly taken up by other feminist theologians, including myself. Carol's essay and later reflections on Yahweh as holy warrior built on her analysis of the power of religion and were important counterpoints to the elevation of this tradition and prophetic calls for social justice in both liberation theologies and many feminist theologies. While she acknowledged that the Exodus and prophetic traditions inspired many movements for social justice, she argued strongly that they were indissolubly connected to the image of a warrior god and therefore shaped and supported the equation of power, war, and violence, so central to patriarchal cultures. In a world threatened by nuclear annihilation, she said, we cannot afford a warlike image of God. Moreover, the prophetic warrior God teaches intolerance toward other religions, especially those that have female images of the divine, and thus helps create a climate in which it is possible to countenance the destruction of peoples who practice other traditions. Carol's blogs and essays written in the last few years on patriarchy as a system of male dominance that arose at the intersection of the control of female sexuality, private property, and war expands on her earlier work as Yahweh as warrior and represents the culmination of the critical strand in her thought. In addition to being a powerful critic, Carol was also a significant constructive theologian and philosopher. Odyssey with the Goddess, written in 1995, was followed in 1997 by Rebirth of the Goddess, her goddess theology. Having worked through her own experiences and come to a solid sense of who the goddess was for her, she wanted to write a book that would combine experience and reflection and make clear the radicality of goddess imagery and thought. As she says in the preface to Rebirth, the emergence of the goddess raises many questions, from her relationship to the God of biblical tradition, to her connection to familiar Greek goddesses, to her nature and meaning. Carol wanted to address these questions and show how the answers necessitate rethinking many of the deeply held and seldom articulated assumptions of Western thought. Interestingly, rebirth follows the basic structure of many traditional theologies, beginning with chapters on epistemology, method, and history, and then moving on to goddess, world, human beings, and ethics. The book thus aims to be a systematic theology of the goddess, I believe the only one that's been written to this day. My favorite book of Carol's is her most solidly philosophical work, She Who Changes, Reimagining the Divine in the World, which appeared in 2003. The fruit of an intellectual love affair with Charles Hartshorne, it is a feminist philosophy of religion rooted in Hartshorne's process thought. It always troubled Carol that the initially relatively permeable boundaries between feminists in different religious traditions seemed to become firmer and more rigid over the years. She Who Changes invites feminists to think together about the nature of divine power and its relation to the world, and to reflect on the common elements in our spiritual visions and practices that are too often masked by traditional religious divisions. The book is a rich and deeply thoughtful account of how process philosophy provides a vocabulary for conceptualizing goddess, God, and exploring the meaning of life in an always changing, interconnected universe. It deals powerfully with the problem of evil and provides reasons for hope in a world filled with suffering. In fact, I recommend that everyone read or reread the chapter on hope in this deeply fraught moment for our democracy and our planet. She Who Changes was Carol's book that started the two of us on the path to writing Goddess in the World. There were, of course, always important differences between Carol and me that we talked about and also argued over. The first and most obvious was my decision to remain within the Jewish tradition and hers to leave Christianity and become a goddess feminist. I remember when decades ago, Ann Barstow gave a paper on the goddess at Chattel-Hoyuk for the New York Feminist Scholars in Religion. Carol was absolutely mesmerized and elated, while I thought it was a nice paper. But quite beyond gender, Carol and I disagreed about the nature of goddess God in ways that became increasingly clear the more theology she wrote. Much as I loved She Who Changes, I thought its understanding of goddess God was profoundly wrong. Carol's definition of goddess as the power of intelligent, embodied love makes clear that she believed in the goddess as a personal presence who cares about the world and who is wholly loving and good. I believe that God is an impersonal creative energy that underlies, animates, and sustains all that is, and that God includes both good and evil. Though we were long aware of this division between us, She Who Changes led us to challenge each other and seek to change each other's minds in a sustained way. 10 years after she wrote She Who Changes, when Carol was thinking of addressing the failure of goddess imagery to be adopted by a wide public, and I wanted to write a book about Jewish reluctance to talk about God, we decided it would be more fun to write about goddess and God together. We thought it might be valuable for ourselves and for others to share our decades of conversation, to address the many things that united us as we sought to articulate a new feminist vision of the sacred, and to describe the divergent perspectives we brought to our common goal. We sidled into the project slowly by each undertaking to write our theological autobiographies and seeing where that led us. What we originally imagined as one chapter each became 3. Our childhoods through our time at Yale, our moving out into the world, and the evolution of our mature thought. We also wrote 2 joint chapters, one to locate our views of the sacred and the history of theology, and one in which we talk about the centrality of feminist theology to our lives and work. Throughout the whole writing process, we were exchanging chapters, asking questions of each other, and pushing each other hard to clarify and elaborate on our thinking. We wanted that exchange also to be evident in the book, and it is in the last 4 chapters, which are devoted to reflecting on each other's theologies or theologies and posing and responding to questions. It was through our conversations that Carol came to change her definition of goddess from the intelligent, embodied love that is the ground of all being, her formulation and rebirth, to the intelligent, embodied love that is in all being, the formulation in Goddess and God that's on the conference flyer. The distinction may be unclear on first hearing, but it was a product of many long discussions that led Carol to new theological insights. Similarly, she repeatedly questioned me about the gaps and inconsistencies in my view of God, helping me to arrive at a much fuller statement of what I believed than I had ever before articulated. A striking trait of Carol's that characterized her up until the time of her death was that she never talked about anyone or shared their ideas without first describing what they looked like. So let me end by saying goodbye to my very tall, very elegant friend of medium build. I first knew her in miniskirts, but more recently in black velveteen slacks and soft pullovers in single colors. At one time with a bouffant, but for most of her life with straight shoulder-length blonde hair, always made up, always well put together. I and we owe her so very much. It is hard to imagine she's not here to continue to unsettle, inspire, and push us to expand our thinking.